Treasure Island, Chapter 5 The Man on the Island. At first, Treasure Island seemed a fascinating place. There were marshes full of willows and odd, outlandish, swampy plants and trees. Here and there, I saw snakes, and one raised his head from a rock and hissed at me with a noise not unlike that of a spinning top. I explored for a while until I wandered into a thicket of live oak trees which grew along the sand. Suddenly, a wild duck flew up in the air, followed by another, and soon, over the whole surface of the marsh, a great cloud of birds hung screaming and circling in the sky above us. I guessed that some of my shipmates must be drawing near. I listened and heard voices, faint but growing louder. I got down on all fours and crawled until I could see down into a little green dell beside the marsh, closely set about with trees. There, Long John Silver and a seaman named Tom stood face to face in conversation. It was clear that Silver was testing Tom, trying to find out if he would join the mutiny.
"I'll not be led away," said Tom. "I'd sooner lose my hand if I forgot my duty."
All of a sudden, he was interrupted. Far away, out in the marsh, arose an angry roar, then another. Tom jumped at the sound, like a horse pricked by a rider's spurs, but Silver winked not an eye. He stood resting lightly on his crutch, watching his companion like a snake about to strike.
"John," said Tom, "what was that?"
"That?" said Silver, with a treacherous smile.
"Oh, I reckon that was Alan."
Then Tom seemed to understand everything all at once.
"Alan,"
he cried, fearing the worst for his friend.
"Well, John Silver, you're no mate of mine, and that's a fact. I'll have no part in your mutiny."
With that, the brave fellow turned his back on the cook and set off toward the beach, but he was not destined to go far. With a cry, Silver seized the branch of a tree, whipped the crutch from under his armpit, and sent the missile hurtling through the air. It struck poor Tom right between the shoulders in the middle of his back. His hands flew up, he let out a gasp, and fell. I felt faint. The whole world seemed to swim before me in a whirling mist. When I gathered my courage to look again, I saw Silver standing next to Tom, who was motionless on the ground. A moment later, Silver pulled out a whistle and blew upon it. I guessed he was calling the other pirates, and I was worried they might find me. I crawled out of the undergrowth and ran as fast as I could. It was all over for me, I thought. I would be captured by the mutineers. I ran without knowing where I was going until a new alarm brought me to a standstill. With a thumping heart, I saw a dark, shaggy figure leap behind a tree trunk. Was it a bear or a monkey? I could not tell, but I was afraid because I was now cut off on both sides. Behind me were the ferocious pirates, and in front of me, the lurking creature. The figure flitted from trunk to trunk like a deer, but it ran on two legs like a man. I was tempted to cry for help when another sighting reassured me that the creature was indeed a man. I took some comfort in this discovery, and in the fact that I had just remembered I carried a pistol in my pocket. I put one hand on my pistol and took a few steps forward. At that precise moment, the man leaped out in the open, threw himself on his knees, and held out his hands as if begging for mercy. I could see that he was an Englishman, like myself, but his clothes were old and tattered, and his skin had been burned by the sun. In fact, his bright eyes looked quite startling on a face so burnt. "Who are you?" I demanded.
I'm been gone, I am," he replied. His voice sounded like a rusty lock. "I haven't spoken with Mom for 3 years. I'm still surprised I still know how to speak."
3 years?" I cried. "Were you shipwrecked here?"
"Nay, friend," said he. "I was marooned."
I had heard the word, and I knew it stood for a horrible kind of punishment common enough among buccaneers. It was my understanding that when a person is marooned, he is abandoned on a desolate island with not much to rely on other than his wits.
"Marooned 3 years ago," continued the man. "I've lived on goats, berries, and oysters, but my heart longs for English food. At night, I dream of cheese."
All this time he had been looking at me and smiling. He seemed to take a childish pleasure in the presence of a fellow creature.
"What's your name?" he asked. Jim Hawkins, I told him. Well now, Jim, he said, if I ever get back to England, I'm changing my ways and the company I keep. I'm a changed man. And Jim, he continued, looking around, lowering his voice to a little more than a whisper, I'm rich. You'll thank your lucky stars, you will, that you was the first to find me. Then a shadow passed over his face, and he took hold of my hand and raised one finger threateningly before my eyes. Now, Jim, he said, tell me true. Is that Flint's ship that you came on? No, I replied. It's not Flint's ship. Flint is dead, but we have some of his men with us. Not a man with one leg, he gasped. John Silver, I asked. Yes, that were his name, he said anxiously. After talking with Ben Gunn for a few minutes, I no longer feared him. In fact, I told him the story of our voyage, and he heard it with the keenest of interest. Well, he said, you and your friends are in a pinch, aren't you? Well, never mind you, just put your trust in Ben Gunn, but tell me one thing, is the squire of yours an honest man? Yes, I said. Suppose I gave him a share of my money. Do you think he would let me sail home with you? He asked. Well, I'm sure he would, I replied. He seemed greatly relieved to hear this. Well then, he went on, I'll tell you my story. I was on Flint's ship when he buried his treasure. He went ashore on this very island with 6 strong men. They were ashore nearly a week and left the rest of us on the ship. Eventually, Flint came back all by himself. There he was. And the 6 men, all dead. How he done it, not a man aboard could make out. Billy Bones was the mate back then, and Silver was also part of the crew. Then, 3 years back, I was on another ship, and we sighted this island. Boys, said I, this is where Flint buried his treasure. Let's go ashore and find it. 12 days we spent looking for it. Then the others gave up and went back aboard. As for you, Benjamin Gunn, says they, here's a musket and a spade and a pickaxe. You can stay here and find Flint's money for yourself. Well, Jim, that's my story. Now be a good lad and run and speak with the squire. Tell him I know this island like it's my own. How am I to get back to the ship? I asked. You can use my boat, he said. I made it with my own 2 hands. I keep it under a white rock along the shore. Then quite suddenly, we heard the boom of a cannon. They've begun to fight, I cried. We stayed together in the undergrowth, unaware of time passing, listening to the sound of cannon and pistol fire. Eventually, I decided I should make my way toward the anchorage. Ben agreed to accompany me. At some point along the way, we spotted a Union Jack fluttering above the trees. Ah, that must be your friends, said Ben Gunn. It can't be, I said, stunned by the sight of the flag. They're on the ship. That must be Silver or some of the other mutineers. Not likely, said Ben Gunn. In a place like this where nobody puts in but gentlemen of fortune, Silver would fly the Jolly Roger. You see, Jim, just over the hill is an old stockade. Flint built it many years ago. I reckon that your friends have retreated to the stockade and Silver has the ship. Well, I said, if it really is them, I should try to help. I'll not go with you, said Ben Gunn. Not till I have an opportunity to meet with the squire in private. If he wants to talk, tell him where he can find me to come with a white flag to show he means well. At that moment, a cannonball came whizzing through the trees and tore up the sand not 100 yards from us. I ran one way and Ben Gunn ran the other. After parting with Ben Gunn, I decided to assess the situation. First, I went to check on the Hispaniola. I saw that she was still anchored in the same place, but now she was flying the Jolly Roger. It seemed that the pirates had indeed taken over the ship. Next, I scouted the shoreline. I spotted a big white rock, and I figured it must be the rock beneath which Ben Gunn hid his boat. Then I made my way through the woods until I came to the stockade, a plain log house surrounded by a tall fence. I saw that Ben Gunn had been right. My friends were in the stockade with the Union Jack flying above them. I called out to them and was warmly welcomed. They told me their story, and I told them mine. When fighting broke out on the ship, they had decided they would be safer on the island, so they escaped in 2 of the landing boats with some guns and supplies. They had heard about the stockade when the pirates saw them rowing away. They fired on them from the ship and then attacked the stockade. Old Red Roof had been killed, and another of our loyal men, Gray, had been injured. After telling my story, I had a chance to look about me. The stockade was made of trunks of pine. Near the door of the stockade was a little spring that welled up and provided fresh water. There was a small chimney in the roof through which only a little smoke found its way out. The rest stayed in the house and kept us coughing. If we had been allowed to sit idle, we should have fallen into the blues, but Captain Smollett divided us into watches. The doctor questioned me about Ben Gunn. "Do you think he is sane, Jim?" I'm not quite sure. He seems a little strange." "Well," said the doctor, "you can't expect a man who has spent 3 years on a deserted island to be as clear-minded as you or me." We had very little in the way of supplies, and the captain was worried. He thought our best hope was to get the better of the buccaneers. They had lost 4 men, and 2 others were wounded.